Our subject today is the academic study of new religions, and new religions are an area that really is relatively recent in terms of academic study. That's because new religions themselves, as the name would indicate, emerged really relatively recently. Typically, most academics regard new religions as having started in the mid to late 19th century with the development of groups like Churches of Latter-day Saints, Mormonism, the Theosophical Society under Madame Helena P. Blavatsky. Groups like that. In the early to mid 20th century, you again had a kind of development of some new religious groups in the United States. But especially in the latter half of the 20th century, that's when new religions began to really emerge. During that same period, you began to see academics studying. Typically, the academics looking at new religions have tried to analyze them, look at them in a relatively unbiased or objective way, at least with an aspiration to objectivity. But scholars differ, and so you have a kind of spectrum. Some scholars tend to be more focused on criticism, critiquing groups, analyzing them. And in other cases, some scholars tend to be more inclined toward defending the groups, which would be typically called apologists. And the majority of scholars belong somewhere in the middle of those groups. Here at Michigan State, new religions represent an area of study for me personally, and it's a course I teach called REL 380. What we look at are models for understanding them. And there have been a number of models that have come out of sociology in particular that are helpful for the study of how religions emerge. The first model is actually called a family model of new religions, and that was developed by a scholar named J. Gordon Melton, pretty well-known scholar and editor of a number of encyclopedias and handbooks. And Melton's model it included some fairly idiosyncratic families, and it was refined as a model by a British scholar by the name of Christopher Partridge. In his book called New Religions, Partridge argues and really makes a pretty persuasive case, I think, that religions come out of other religions to a considerable degree. And so many new religions emerge out of, for example, amalgam, a kind of synthesis of, for instance, Christianity. So you have a Christian family, Judaism, Jewish family, Islam, Muslim religious family. And then you have also, of course, Asian religions, Buddhism, Hinduism. You have offshoots of those, or groups and individuals that are influenced by those. But then you also have groups though influenced by particular pre-existing traditions, nonetheless also seem relatively new in how they function. And so those groups, people differ in terms of the categories that they might fit in. Some have a category for Western esoteric religions, those that are influenced by groups like Rosicrucianism or Freemasonry, or offshoots of various magical traditions. Then there are other scholars that suggest that there are different ways to look at how these groups develop, irrespective of the particular families that they belong to. And those scholars argue that there are models for understanding how a group emerges. For example, Roy Wallace argued that groups tend to fit into categories. So you have some groups that are world-rejecting. They tend to reject, by that he means conventional values, for instance, consumerism. They tend to be critical. World-rejecting groups tend to be critical of consumerism and perhaps modernity as a whole, might be anti-modernist. Then you have world-affirming groups, new religions that encourage consumerism and say that by belonging to this religion, by practicing it, you actually become a more successful consumer. And then you have world accommodating, and an example of that would be Pentecostal, for instance, where his argument is that they accommodate the values of the world, but are not necessarily specifically world affirming or world rejecting. So that's another way of analyzing how new religions emerge, or the models under which they function. A couple of other scholars, William Bainbridge and Rodney Stark, developed a model called a series of models for thinking about how new religions emerge. One of those models is called entrepreneurial. And the entrepreneurial model holds that what drives the development of new religions is really meeting a market. And on top of that, it's a kind of business model. And a characteristic example of that would be Scientology. In fact, Hugh Urban, in his recent book, The Church of Scientology, argues that Scientology is in fact as much a business, arguably, as it is under the category religion. And that would fit pretty well under the notion of an entrepreneurial model. And there are other groups that these scholars also place there. Another model, actually, that they suggest, that is Bainbridge and Stark, is a psychopathological model. And some scholars argue that groups that develop with a charismatic leader, the leader is actually often driven by a kind of psychopathology, and scholars that emphasize that model tend to be more critical of new religions, as you might imagine. And then a third model is a subculture model, which argues that groups emerge to meet a certain kind of cultural need, lack that individuals might have, perhaps a need for parental figure. And also, a subculture model argues that that a group offers certain kinds of compensators. Compensators would be something that fills a gap or fills a need that people have. And so these different models sometimes apply they overlap, and sometimes they apply in different ways. But those are some kind of thumbnail sketches of sociological models that I found useful. In particular, the family model, I think, is productive in thinking about where a religion is coming from or emerging. What its background is tells you at least some things about it. Now, some new religions that have gotten into the news and that people think of when they think of new religions are quite controversial. Oftentimes people focus on the most flamboyant or the most catastrophic, tragic events. One thinks here of the suicide murders of Jim Jones in the People's Temple community, or the deaths in Waco, Texas of the Branch Davidians after a siege by the United States federal government, or again in Japan, the Aum Shinrikyo and the deaths in underground in Tokyo by poison gas by an apocalyptic group. Shinrikyo was the group's name. Those kinds of events are what often stand out for people, but actually there are thousands and thousands of new religions, so many that it's very difficult even to keep track of them all. And by no means do those kinds of events describe or characterize all these different groups. It just happens that those are the ones that get the most publicity, and that's what people often think of. So in thinking about new religions, it's valuable to have some of these models in mind. It's an absolutely fascinating area, and I'd urge people to take a look at new religions. One of my specialties is actually esoteric dimensions of new religions, and there are many groups that are offshoots of or derive from or even represent Western esotericism or esoteric religion. These are groups that claim that they have inner dimensions of particular teachings. They might have emerged from a Hindu guru tradition, but represent something really fundamentally new and somewhat disconnected, and yet still connected to Hinduism. And the same is true with Western esoteric traditions. You may find a group that claims Rosicrucianism and thereby has a tangential connection to that semi-secret group, and yet historical connection, and yet ultimately represents something really quite new and different. So it's a fascinating area, and I encourage you to pursue some of the resources that I've compiled in terms of the study of new religions. There are some fascinating books. Hope this has been helpful and useful for you, and thank you for your attention.